Welcome to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered with Perry Clark. This program looks at mental health from unique perspectives and shows you how to manage your life by finding the knots that help you and stay away from the ones that could be a disadvantage. Now, here is your host, Perry Clark.
Hello all, welcome back to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist here with you. And I want to start, as always, that this podcast is for entertainment and educational purposes only and does not constitute working with licensed mental health professional. Please seek one out in your state. So it's time for another one of our TherapBlerding Out, and that also means that I've got my favorite other TherapBlerd here with me. We're going to be talking about the series X Men 97. Now, the fact that by the time the series is long finished before we get to season 2. So we're probably going to be very much talking about spoilers here. So I'm sorry about that, but it's kind of integral for what we're going to be talking about because there's plenty of wonderful things in this show, but there's also some things that as therapists make me immediately cringe and want to, how can I put it? Put Xavier in a headlock. But that aside, let's go ahead and get into our introductions again. And my fellow therapist here to talk about it, Mercedes Samudio, is a licensed clinical social worker, best-selling author, international speaker, and visionary entrepreneur. She works with parents around the world, is developing a healthy parental identity, and with her revolutionary parental identity development model and incorporating her shame-proof parenting philosophy to help reduce the shame parents experience as they raise healthy children. Mercedes is also trained in trauma-informed modalities, which she's used in her work with parents to help them heal the past traumas and can influence the ways parents interact with their children and themselves. Outside of professional life, she's a supporting parent. Mercedes is married to her best friend and soulmate, and they live in sunny California with their 3 furry children, as well as also has the title of doctor. Welcome back, Mercedes.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
We're going to need to get an updated one, then now you got the doctor title in there, too.
Yes.
Yes. So, as I said, we're here to talk about X Men 97. Now, there's multiple episodes that are in there covering a number of different emotional issues and spectrums that go on. So, I know we're not going to be hit all of them, but we're going to try and hit some of the high points ones, too. That, again, both work for us as blerds, and that also that what comes up for us as therapists looking at this series and some of the storylines and tropes that may have been more problematic than they thought, but is also what has been used to create drama. Not necessarily good drama, but drama. So your thoughts?
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. I think shows like this tend to be allegorical and metaphorical just because of the nature of it. I think X-Men have always been that way, right? When they came out in the comics, they were that way. When we were watching it in the 90s, they were that way. And I think Bo DeMaio and the team just brought it up to the 2024 level of how are we going to talk about these mutants, so to speak? And mutant is such a diverse word, but in the context of X-Men being people with an actual genetic mutation that gives them superpowers, right? And so how do we deal with that as an allegory for diversity, I would say, right? Because I think they try to touch on everything. And I agree. I think as a cartoon and a TV show adaptation of X-Men, it was great. As we start to look at what they were trying to do and some of the messages they were trying, they fell short. And you realize, I wish they had more time for this, or I hope they dive back into this later on.
Well, and one of the biggest ones there is the continued issue of, two of the biggest ones are the aspect of mutants versus the rest of the world and how mutants are viewed. But the other big one is the whole back and forth between Xavier and Magneto. And just like after watching that, I just so many things like you're failing on so many accounts. You're not going to be actually able to have change because you keep staying in the same circular pattern and reasoning. And after a while, and this may be, again, one of those things as we are adults, as we have grown up, as we have learned the things we have, we can continue to see that circular pattern that is just keeping them trapped.
Yes. And I think that's I love that you bring in that perspective, because you and I both watched these in the 90s, right? Like, we knew what they were. We had a different perspective of that, because I know for a fact I was a kid. I was just watching the cool mutants beat up the bad guys and win at the end of the day. And yeah, if there's a be careful what you wish for lesson in there somewhere, sure. Right? Like, I was able to pick that up. I feel like this one elevated that be careful what you wish for as more of like personal journeys. And as a result, I think that's exactly what we ended up seeing. We ended up seeing Charles really fail in that understanding of, we got to save the mutant. I mean, we got to save the humans, and we can't do this to humans, and we have to use our powers for good. I think his chokehold, if you will, on that ideology is what pushes everybody over the edge, even the humans. Yeah. I think everyone, because he's so unable to see that his way isn't the only way to exist as a mutant. You don't have to exist as the savior of mankind, because that's almost as bad as becoming the villain of mankind. Just to be a little bit of a nerd here, jumping into another comic book series that is DC, the Authority, right? Where they're kind of those people. They are the superhero police. They go into each universe and like police the superheroes, if you will. That's kind of what Charles feels like to me on times, where he has the idea all mutants should be like him. They should go through Xavier's school. They should be, good and passive in a way and noble, right? And he ignores the fact that there are so many mutants who don't fit that mold.
Let alone have had his, or even have the experience he's had.
Yeah. Or have the access to the resources that he has, right? Or has, I think at one point someone said, you spent all your time in a galaxy far, far away. We were over here dealing with the reality of it, and so like Charles, I think a lot of the times becomes, and I think even more so now, kind of I'm losing my word here, but kind of the worst of the idealist, right? The idealist who's so tunnel vision that they can't see that their idealism and their hope for a better future can't happen until they realize what's happening now. They can't always be like, oh, we'll get together and humans and mutants forever. And but at the cost of each mutant's identity being erased, at the cost of every mutant falling under your ideology, that's no different than Magneto, wanting all the mutants just to take complete power. And so I agree with you. I think Charles here even gets to be more flawed. And I think we get to examine him a little bit more of, is he really the leader that we've always thought him to be?
Well, especially when we get to see him trying to, quote unquote, walk into somebody else's house and empire and try and basically say you're doing it wrong with the Shi'ar.
I love that. That was perfect. Yes. Yeah.
And the fact that you're talking about an entire other culture who has had several thousand years of history and has a certain way of life, which, again, not that it's wonderful because we saw them having a fight with the Kree, but still the fact that you walked into somebody else's house and then told them their cooking ain't shit.
Exactly. Literally. But that's Charles.
And the aspect of his high and mightiness, which actually made me, I had to go and look up his character bio, and I had to look at his educational settings. And he's got a PhD in genetics, biophysics, psychology, anthropology, and psychiatry. Now that's impressive in and of itself, but okay, psychiatry and psychology. Clearly, he did not do any of the courses of actually sitting with people as opposed to doing the research section.
Yeah, he just went blue. He just did all the academics. Right? Yeah. He just did all the academic part of it.
Which is why even his attempts well, as we see later in the series, to rebuild Magneto's or Eric's mental landscape, it's just literally had me screaming, is that is not how you deal with trauma.
But in a sense, it kind of is. And while I agree, I actually posted this on Threads that for me, well, not that part of it, so to speak, but for me, I feel like that is essentially what ends up happening to us when we're in trauma. We're literally in this little space where all of it's just crashing around us.
Mm-hmm.
What I saw is a friend trying to use his psychology degree to help another friend.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't hate it.
Yeah.
What I definitely hear though is this idea that when we're trying to help someone through their trauma, right, it's really important to let them be there and experience it as opposed to try to rewrite the narrative for them. And that's something that I noticed he was doing. Remember this, right? He was taking him where he wanted him to go in his memories so he can pull him out, right? And I agree, this is not how we help people with their trauma. We don't tell them what memories to go to. We don't even tell them how to feel in those memories. But once they say, I'm back here, I'm where I saw my family die as a result of a whole group of people killing us out, you sit with that. You don't be like, well, we got to get out of this. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
You're like, okay, I see where you're at, right? And I'm here for you to be there for you.
Which creates the standpoint of it's still unresolved trauma. So it's not surprising Magneto is going to keep coming back to his particular manifesting idea of mutants now need to be the kings and leaders of the world.
Because, and again, I really appreciate that they kept harping on Magneto's trauma, because once he finally does go ape shit and full nuclear, you understand him. You're not like, why did he do this? You're like, no, man, like he has, number one, he's a Holocaust survivor. So he's had enough trauma at all. That's it. He doesn't need any more. Right? And then he's a mutant. He doesn't need any more trauma. Then he's living in a world where no one likes mutants and they're systemically being killed all the time. Okay, I don't need any more of that. Then
which harkens back happens. Which also harkens back to the first one, Holocaust.
Right. So then here we are at another Holocaust in the sense we're at Genosha, right? And so then he watches all of his people, right? Again, and he's sitting there trying. The thing that I think really hit for me is then he's sitting there trying to actually save people and they still perish, right? That's like trauma on trauma on trauma. You know, if Magneto Eric was sitting with us, we'd definitely be exploring CPTSD with him, right? And that layers of it, that, like you said, if I have the power to save people, what am I going to do with it? I'm going to use it. And Magneto has the power, if anybody, to save his people, and he does that, right? In that episode where he says enough, and all electricity goes out of the world, right? You realize this man has finally had enough. That's that level of trauma where it's like, I've reached my window of tolerance. I'm over it. I'm done. You know what I mean? And so I agree. I think that this show gave us a lot of trauma. It didn't really show us the proper ways on how to manage that trauma.
Exactly. And it's where it then becomes a past standpoint of where is this then going back in that circular aspect of just keeping the trauma going? Because even
you have to for them.
Right. And that's where that also becomes that very struggle point, is remembering where is the drama that is created for this story versus where what we actually do in the rest of the world, which is work on that trauma. And this is a bigger issue, I think, overall for a lot of comics, especially because we've got an audience now that runs a much broader age range than what it was always intended. That part of the disillusion, and this is may even becoming part of the aspect of the hero fatigue we've seen with movies, is so much of us don't just stay locked in that time, and that we move on. And at that standpoint, we need our heroes to also move on and either work on their trauma, which is one of the things I know some of the people are probably have had issues with, like the Doctor Who series, and their admission that everything that happened with the doctors splitting into two is the aspect of one of the doctors, one of the senses of self, needs to actually go through and do healing, has to go and deal with the trauma of the constant lives, the constant death, the constant sacrifice before he's ready to go back out there and do it again.
Yeah.
Because again, when we do see characters and heroes who do keep doing that, what we also are watching is them die inside.
And I think that's something that if I can really, God, I love that. I love everything you just shared, because I think that's something that if we put a model of reference for what we're talking about out there, that's what the MCU did really well throughout their whole saga. I was talking to someone about that the other day, where I was watching Civil War and I realized that for the first time, the heroes had to sit and watch the destruction that they caused while they were saving people, right? And so they had to watch what happened in New York, what happened in Sokovia, what happened in Wakanda. Like, you've done all of these things in saving people, but you haven't dealt with the fact that you've caused so much destruction and killed people, right? And so as a result, the heroes now have to start dealing with the guilt and the overwhelm and the remorse of, as we're heroing, who are we really influencing? And so when we go back to X Men 97, you're right, we didn't get that arc of, did they realize all of their inner turmoil is spilling over into the world? Right? All of their unhealed stuff is actually causing a lot of dissension even within their group. Right? One of the things that I think, go ahead.
Sorry to cut you off there, but one of the other points is that also that standpoint of how did not addressing these things actually really dissolve the bonds of the X-Men as opposed to strengthen them. And that's also one of those elements of where unresolved dealing with trauma doesn't keep people together unless they're doing it, frankly, out of either obligation or unresolved idea that they need to save.
Yeah, or life or death. Life or death. So a lot of the times they came together on life or death, where it's the X-Men against the Sentinels. So we're not resolved, but if we don't come together, we'll all die, right? And so I agree with you. I think that's another misstep of Charles, that as he created a team of people that could only come together to fight, but they didn't know what to do after that. So after we've done fighting, and if you notice in the old cartoon, they would all leave a lot of the time. People came and went, no one really stayed in the mansion. And to watch it this time, where people did the same thing. One thing that came up for me is watching Storm's kind of trajectory again, where when she had a traumatic event, she was left alone. She actually left and isolated. Right? You have a whole house of people who are your friends, who are supposed to love you, and she just left. She was like, I have to. I can't be here. I don't feel like I can be here. That spoke volumes to me for a lot of reasons. Being Black, being female, being now that I can't contribute to the group. I'm no longer needed. Right? I can't do anything on the team, so to speak. And so she spends much of the series alone dealing with her trauma, away from the people that she has an established relationship with. He comes back once Forge helps her get her power back, then she's able to come back and be in the team, right? I felt really overwhelmed by that, because again, there's that strong Black woman trope again. There's that strong Black woman trope coming again. And again, I love Storm. She's always been a source of strength and regality and beauty. And at the same time, what would it look like for a story where Storm was still embraced and loved and taken care of, right? What would it look like for us to see Storm manage her unresolved trauma from even when she was a kid, being revered in her culture, and having to deal with all of that at a young age, right?
And equally, just adding on to not just the point where she was revealed, but also the point where she lost her parents, which is one of those critical stories that goes on and it was even brought up and was even hinted at the aspect of her issue with claustrophobia because of the trauma of what happened when she was younger. So that's also in that mix. And Storm, I love her too. Anytime there's a comic with her, I am always getting, particularly that one, even though we know, sadly, they do not know how to write for a Black woman. I mean, really, get Roxanne Gay, Nettie Oakenfold, get any of the other Black women writers out there to come and do a Storm story. Marvel,
which is let's just pause. That's kind of weird that Storm has been, I think, if you can correct me, how long has she been in the comics?
She was introduced in the 80s.
Okay, so I was going to say 80s. I just didn't trust myself. I did a Final Jeopardy thing where I just didn't trust myself, right? So since the 80s, right? Okay, so just for point of reference, I am 38. I was born in the 80s. So that means for 38 years, we've never allowed someone to take Storm, right? And have a Black woman do her, not just one issue or a random issue, to actually take her full arc throughout a whole series. I agree with you, Marvel. Somebody over there needs to deal with that. And there's a lot of people who could have done it over the years. There are a ton of people now who are writing that could definitely take an actual in-universe, in-canon Storm story and bring her into this era with a Black female voice as the writer, with, I would say, even a Black female staff, because we have writers, we have artists, we have inkers, we have pencilers, we have, colorists, like we have that. That would be a beautiful story arc to have that be the team that did a Storm story arc. Just throwing it out there since we're recording, and it'll be out there one day. When it happens, you and I can say that we've been waiting for it.
I mean, just look at what was done with Wakanda and the Shuri comics. But again, we are getting away from, we're talking about X-Men 97 here. And the broader universe as well, with what, and stepping away from our reverence for Storm, unless it is Storm.
Queen Storm.
Yes. But and I mean, there was the aspect too about the time, as my partner and I were talking about, is like, this is not the 616 universe, because T'Chaka is the Black Panther, not T'Challa.
But this is also T'Chaka in the 90s.
Yeah, but T'Chaka was dead.
Okay. Oh, was
T'Challa?
I don't know.
The primary Black Panther we've always followed is T'Challa, and that's because he took it over from his father.
Right.
So whether he stepped down from the throne or whether he was dead, which is in the actual comics, when we first meet the Black Panther, it's T'Challa with the Fantastic Four.
Gotcha.
So we're not in the same 616 universe. Despite that, but
which I'll give you this then. Since we're there on that, one of the things that I noticed was in one of the episodes, the Watcher was there, right? Yep. And we know that when the Watcher shows up, even if it's not within universe, this is part of that multiverse that we're in a sense that he now, and that to me felt really cool, because seeing the Watcher means that it might not be in our universe, but this story is within that multiverse that we're starting to kind of dabble into a little bit now.
Oh yeah, and the fact that the Watcher's there, and as when they said, even with when Cable was trying to keep coming in and changing the event, it's like, this is a fixed point.
It is. To
borrow from Doctor Who again, it's a fixed point in time.
Yeah. Because he can never do it. No matter where he comes, it's like it has to happen. And that's something that actually the MCU is exploring, these fixed points in time, because the same thing with Christine's death, right? Like it always has to I mean, not Christine's death, his hands, Doctor Strange getting into the accident. Like that always has to happen. In the Spider-Verse movie, Miguel was talking about, these are certain things that happen.
The canon event.
If you mess them up, it creates total chaos. And now that we're jumping into more nerd stuff, my question then becomes that in the larger multiverse, who is over making sure things happen the right way? I know in our universe it's the TVA, but is that for the larger multiverse? Are they the ones making sure that everybody stays? That's just me being a complete nerd throwing that.
Well, from what I know and what comics I have read and what I've read over my partner's shoulder while he's reading some of them, there's a couple of different forces that are all involved in that, because you've got like the TVA, which shows up more in the Fantastic Four, maybe Avengers, but there's also the Captain Britain Corps, which was also another of the forces that's supposed to be overseeing the multi-universe and so forth, or Captain Britannia Corps, which was introduced in the Excalibur series. But there's several groups that are, quote unquote, responsible for managing the multiverse.
Okay. That makes sense. Thank you for that. I appreciate the knowledge on that, because as we get into that, I am getting like even more interested in it, because I am not the comics person. My husband is the comics person. I'm more the TV shows, cartoons, live action movie person. And so a lot
Mm-hmm.
of my stuff comes from that knowledge, with peppered in with like definitive, bigger, larger story arcs that I've read, if that makes sense. And so I appreciate you giving me some of those more nuanced, intricate spaces, because it helps to fill in what
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, because I've only read large story arcs in terms of the comics, if that makes sense.
Exactly. And that's one of those other balancing points between what we see within what they get produced in the television versus, again, the history of the comics. I mean,
Yeah.
there are certain
Yeah.
ones that shows like, I'll say it, Naomi and Black Lightning. I love the idea of those shows, but it's like, I don't think they had enough history and material for them to draw on to really start a television show after.
Yeah.
And then it suffers what is often what I guess would basically describe as a Game of Thrones situation, where it reaches a point where you've lost the book, where the books don't exist. So now they have to go off and create an ending that doesn't
Yeah.
match what would have happened in, say, the books and the history, which now creates a problem for.
Yes.
And those two
Yes.
franchises, just to give examples, don't have the same history or amount of history that things like X Men do. Because I mean, as we're just briefly going back to Storm, I mean, just the history I know of Storm, between her death of her parents, to her being worshipped as a goddess, to her time as a thief on the streets of Cairo and meeting T'Challa, to the aspects of her adventures with her early adventures with the X Men, her depowering, losing her powers in the X Men, her leading the X Men while depowered, her experience with Nanny getting de-aged and then having to grow up again,
Yeah.
to her losing her ability to walk, to now her being the Queen of Mars. She's gone through a lot of ages, and there's a lot of also things that they're jumping the stuff together. Which was coming back to the other thing I was going to talk about, was something about some of the stuff in the larger universe, not just Storm, but what we were seeing with Dr. Val Cooper and the aspect of her realizing what Magneto was saying. Even to the standpoint, even Bastion, which even that storyline, I got some issues with as well. But the fact that what Bastion was saying was he has a program, as a fundamentally machine, knowing history, knowing an outcome, knows how emotions will turn from following the program.
Yes. And that's his whole motivation.
Right. And he wants to follow the program, which fundamentally, which is something that's come up in a number of the comics, is for the Sentinels to really succeed in wiping out mutant kind, it also means wiping out humankind.
Well, yeah. Because at the end of the day, mutants are human. Mutants are humans with a genetic mutation, right? And so you're right. You're right.
For all intents and purposes, mutants come from humans.
Yep. And if I can throw this in there, one of the things that you brought up as soon as you brought up Bastion is I actually really appreciated him, because he kind of hones down more, or really doubles down on what we've been talking about with Charles, because of Charles not knowing or not always understanding his role in the mutant history or in the mutant kind of world. He actually ended up messing things up, right? Where his mom pulled him further away from mutants. Now that was already going to happen, and that was kind of foretold. Right. But if we're taking this kind of an allegorical thing, there's this kind of idea where, because Charles refuses to have any other ideology or only bring people in through his understanding of how they should show up, there's a lot of mutants that were out there that probably needed more support and more protection, but Charles didn't think to go get them. Or when he did, he messed up his pitch, and the parents were like, never, 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 you know what I mean? And I think about Bastion being this kid with all of that programming and no support. Having a mom who did not like mutants. So my mom doesn't even like the part of me that I am. I have to be something else, right? This person then becomes our main villain, who already has been programmed to hate mutants, who lived in a world that hated mutants who lived in a home that hated mutants. If that's not an allegory for reality, I don't know what is, right? That this young man was already programmed that way, and then he kept being in environments that told him, yeah.
That supported it, yeah. And that's a big one. And that's also, again, ones that help bring about what we also can now see as legacy trauma or generational trauma.
Yeah. Specifically, and it goes back to Charles, right? He's led this group for there's been enough people here that he's led enough people to be like, wow, I've influenced a whole generation of people, right, to think the way I have, who have already generationally been brutalized, oppressed. Like you just said, Storm had her own stuff before she got here. Gambit had his own stuff. Rogue had her own stuff for sure, right? Like everybody who landed on his, Scott had his own stuff, right? Like everyone who landed on his doorstep, he said, I know the cure. I'll make you a superhero. Then you never have to worry about ever being defeated ever again. Like, that's not how you deal with all that stuff, is it? But that's what he did. He put him in the danger room, taught him how to fight Sentinels, and was like, good. Go out into the world, my X Men. And they're like, what about all that other stuff that was going on underneath these people?
So I think that's a perfect place for us to take a break here. So we'll come back after this to continue this, because I think that's a very good point to come up with as we go into the next section. So stay tuned here on Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with Dr. Mercedes Samudio, LCSW, and we'll be back shortly.
Voice America is on LinkedIn. Connect with us today.
Our lives and the world around us can get messy and frustrating. Untangle and Grow Counseling's focus is to untangle that mess and make sense of it so you have a good foundation to build and grow from. Visit us on the web at untangleandgrowcounseling.com. Perry Clark offers individual psychotherapy, couples and family therapy, and adolescence therapy from a variety of coping materials and resources. Visit untangleandgrowcounseling.com for more information.
Become a member of VoiceAmerica.com. It's easy, and best of all, it's free. Start out by going to our homepage or any of our channels and click register at the top. Once you've created an account and signed in, you can create your own custom library, opt into our newsletter, search by show, host, guest, or topic of interest, or browse millions of hours of content across all of our Voice America radio channels. Membership gets you more. Visit VoiceAmerica.com today to get started and tailor the listening experience to your taste.
Live up to your fullest potential. This is the Voice America Empowerment Channel.
You are listening to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. If you have a question or comment about our podcast, send an email to pclark@untyingknotspodcast.com. That's pclark@untyingknotspodcast.com. And now, back to the program.
Welcome back to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with you. And with me is, for our Blerding Out episode, Dr. Mercedes Samudio, LCSW, and we're talking about X Men 97. So we sort of had to stop ourselves in the break here because there's the confluence of topics come together as we were just talking about that standpoint of, and I'm blanking on some of it, but some of the issues that one of the big issues that came up during X Men 97's reboot was the aspect of it being quote unquote woke, was the complaints that were often being had about that. And really the aspect of, like, have you ever actually looked at what was going on in the X-Men? It's like, it's been ideally woke from the beginning, even though Xavier's got some issues with his ideal and his pedestal, which led me to ask the question of, why did you read X-Men in the first place? If you're completely missing that aspect of the woke message, or the message about oppression, the message about feeling othered, what and why were you reading it in the first place?
100% agree with you. 100% agreed with you.
And the only answer I kept coming back to is you like the idea of power, which now that as I started primes the pump, coming back to what you were saying just before we left for the break was that aspect of, yeah, Xavier has taught people how to fight and use their abilities, but not actually live.
Yes. Yes. And I think if we go into that, and I love kind of how we talked about it a little bit, which is there is that cycle sometimes. And here we go back into that cycle, right? Because if people don't manage their trauma, they just put a Band-Aid on it, or in this case, they put a costume over it, right? We're the X Men, right? It doesn't actually get resolved. And it's what you said. I now am just fighting my way out of all these things, constantly fighting my way out of everything, right? I also never understand what's going on with me. And so when it comes to no fighting, right, we don't know how to live. We don't know how to show up for our friends, right? We allow them to just kind of leave. We don't know how to have tough conversations. And I think this is something that X Men 97 kind of remedied with some folks, like with Scott Summers and his son. They had some of those tough conversations. And I think Storm and Rogue had girlfriend conversations, but they didn't go much deeper than that.
You mean,
like, hey, girl.
You mean Jean?
Sorry. Yes. Storm and Jean.
And Jean.
I said Rogue. My bad.
Yeah.
Storm and Jean. Thank you. Yes. Had some of those girlfriend moments, but again, they were kind of just on the surface. And so I say all that to say, this is where I think once you get that power, you think, now I'm done. I now have the power, just like the people who had power over me. Now I've got it. Right. Which
then comes to the aspect of one of the issues that we work with when people who have been through abuse situations have the choice. Fundamentally, either they heal by having connections and working with other people and being reconnected to people, or sadly, which keeps the cycle going, they get caught up on the idea of the power trap. That the only way to have to get power back because it's been taken from them is to now operate from the same standpoint of the people who took the power from them, and therefore they continue to perpetuate the trauma, which comes back to the standpoint of why did you read comics in the first place? What did you feel dispowered by? Yeah, seeing the aspect of Cyclops' beam or Storm's lightning or Wolverine's claws made you feel powerful that you didn't have to feel those things again, or you thought you didn't have to feel those things again.
Yeah. And I think that's why a lot of us did, right? So again, that idea of what does woke mean to you, right? And I think that's a whole societal issue that X-Men will never be able to erase, right? But this idea of like, what do you really think woke means, right? If you were able to find solace and find a voice in these characters, why would you not want other people to do that, right? What is that barrier for you, right? Because again, I think many of us came to comics for that exact same reason. We wanted to feel powerful. We wanted to see the bad guy lose. We wanted to know that, the bad guy's going to get their just desserts, and it's going to be because the good guys did so, right? So if you're looking at wokeness, what if the good guys were people who looked like everybody in the world and came from different spaces, right? If you don't want that, then again, I agree. What are you reading X-Men for? Because that's what X-Men is all about. Right?
But also very much the black and white thinking of, and the sad reality is in the world, good guys don't always win. Sometimes actually a lot of times there's a stalemate.
Yeah, you're not wrong.
And again, that's getting into that trapped issue that comics have in the standpoint of they're stuck in a holding pattern. Yep.
I agree with you, right? It's one of the reasons why, again, I appreciated what the MCU did. At Infinity War, they lost, right? They actually had to sit through. We did not win this time. We did not. All of our machinations and good guyness did not overthrow the bad guy this time. And I think that's something that kind of almost happened here with X Men 97, where they didn't really defeat Bastion. He just kind of got took his little wounds and said, I'll be back. So they didn't really defeat him. They actually have a worse problem now, if you remember that, right? And so I agree with you. I think, if anything, what I really want to share here before we move out of power, though, is one of the things that I would love to really pay attention to in superhero movies is that idea of power, right? And so when we're looking at someone like any of the X Men, I was trying to pick somebody, but any of them who have been oppressed and have gone through the worst of the worst, for them to finally find solace and power in Xavier's school, to then have to go out into the world and think, now I know how to fight. I can do anything. To pay attention to how, wow, that is a very healthy way to think about things when you're a kid and you just want to really stand up for yourself. I think the larger story is something you and I have been talking about, which is healing that trauma so you can get out of that cycle, right? So it's not, I got to be the good guy and I got to get the bad guy. That's not that black or white thinking. It's this idea that something bad happened to me. And if I don't understand that, I'll constantly be in this cycle. If I don't give myself space to pay attention to that, if I don't give myself an opportunity to heal from that, whatever that's going to look like, I'll always be in this good guy, bad guy kind of battle where I'm always trying to be the good guy. I'm always trying to amass enough power to beat the bad guy. And that's exhausting. If that makes sense, it's very exhausting.
It's also a very big premise that we see in Japanese anime too. Always get stronger. It's like strong. There's multiple different ways to get stronger. And there's multiple different ways that you can have other outcomes. Yes, you can get technique, but the technique does not make up for the strength that you're seeing, and that you need to go into these. And that also comes down into that trapped in the cycle between, again, Xavier and Magneto, but even what we saw too with the skew between Xavier and Scott.
That one was a good skew. I like that one too.
And the very fundamental reality is like, yes, your lives are not just all about fighting. And despite what Xavier thought he was doing, he was not giving them a life. Yeah.
And I love that you say that, because that conversation is a conversation that I think often mimics the parent-child conversation. The parent believes that I'm giving you everything you need to live, but once the kid gets out to the world, they realize, I don't have everything I need. What does that look like? What I loved about that conversation is Charles was able to say, this is what that looked like, right? I made you into someone who couldn't leave this life, right? I made you into someone who only felt like a leader at the helm of something like this. And so that's what that looks like, I think. And I think that conversation needs to be had by mentor to mentee, supervisor to supervisee, parent to child, even if your child is like 30 or 40, where having that realization of, I thought I prepared you, I thought I did everything, but now you're coming back saying, I can't get out of this. I don't know what else to do. Can we start having those type of conversations? Because that's part of healing our trauma too. Can we heal the people who cared for us? I appreciate what you did, but you kind of didn't help me live, if you will. You know what I mean?
And those individuals also realizing where they did fail.
Yes.
And I think this also comes back to, as we said, breaking from the good guy, bad guy, the black and white thinking, is the aspect of consequences, which is a very massive one. Is, as we were talking about earlier, that all this damage was done in the world, and now you're dealing with the consequences. I mean, this was going back to the whole Batman Superman movie, the standpoint of the fight with Superman caused somebody to get broken legs. And while Batman's character was trying to do everything possible to take the responsibility and care for this guy, even though it was just money,
yes,
you weren't actually doing the social connections and so forth, checking in on them. And that is, again, the consequences of their actions. And one of the consequences of, just because you're the well-meaning parent doesn't mean that you control the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is going to teach a whole other set of lessons that, unless your child is now able to process and see those different things, they're going to get stuck in the cycle.
Yeah. And I think that's the hardest part of having that discussion about Charles, is that he cared for these kids, right? He gave them a home. He taught them, like you said, techniques and skills. And then now, as they are adults living in the actual world, he's got to come to terms with, how much of that preparation supported them, and maybe how much of that preparation became a barrier to them growing and living and thriving, if you will. And I think that's something that I hope continues to be explored, because that's part of trauma too. I think oftentimes we think of trauma as these big, loud moments, but sometimes it's because the way we were cared for, right? Yes, we had a loving home, but there were a lot of things that maybe weren't taken care of, or maybe the ideology that I left with has me in this tunnel vision where I can't get out of it. And I think, again, what I appreciated here was Charles being able to at least be reflective, even if he couldn't help them get out of that pattern, right? He was at least able to be reflective. I didn't make the best decisions. I may have done these things that put you in this space. I think it's really important for caregivers to have those type of conversations with the person they cared for.
Which I think also then goes to the relationship between him and Magneto as well, because he's, on one hand, he's still trying to play that caregiver when, as a friend, and sometimes as a friend, we're not here to caregive. We're here to be in the misery with them, our friend.
Now you're preaching,
we are
Perry.
Here to sometimes just be a witness to what they're going through.
Yeah.
And there again becomes that standpoint of a lot of these characters, at least the way it was portrayed in X-Men 97, there's not a lot of them looking beyond the world, beyond themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very tunnel vision. Very, everybody, you know, we didn't talk about Rogue's whole journey, but her journey was very tunnel vision.
Oh, yes.
Right. And so, like, you know, I agree with you, right? That once I'm angry, once I've been hurt, once this has happened, and it's because they have that power. Right? Think about that. They've seen what people in power do. Now I've got the power. I can punch now.
Well, not just that. There's and this also comes back to the big one that, as I was watching the stuff with Magneto, but it even comes back to Rogue, is you're not actually addressing their pain.
Nope.
You're saying, it's like, no, we need to go back and play nice. And it's like, you've never actually addressed what their pain is. And when we deal with trauma and we deal with therapy, we actually have to deal with what that pain is. We actually have to speak to it and about it, as opposed to saying that it just getting swept under the carpet or thrown in the closet or pushed out the door.
Yeah. Yeah.
That, yes, you have been through, for Magneto, yes, you have been through the shit between the Holocaust and now Genosha. You've got every reason to be pissed. No, we're not going to acknowledge that you've got a reason to be pissed, because we just need everybody to get along. We have no reason to deal with Rogue being in actual grief and hurting and willing to do the stuff she did, because this is all grief.
Yeah. That, if we're talking about cycle for Rogue, again, this is just the next one for her. Right? This is just the next one. So she's at her breaking point too when she makes those type of decisions. Not
to mention the messaging that's all about, oh, Rogue fixes broken men. She hasn't fixed anybody. She didn't fix it. Yeah, she did not fix it. She did not fix Magneto. She did not fix Gambit.
No.
And there becomes also the mechanisms we see where somebody feels like having another child is going to fix the relationship.
Yeah, that was deep too. That was deep. And here's the deal. I think this is where what you're sharing and what we talked about at the beginning and what we've kind of talked about is each of these characters has been taught by Charles or the world that I can just fight through this. I'll have another baby, right? I'll make this decision. I'll go over here. I'll date this guy. No, I'll move over here, right? These are the type of decisions they make because no one's dealing with the fact that these adults now have had really tumultuous trajectories, right? Not just being mutant, because for some of them, they didn't even know they were mutants before, but think about what happens when they came out, right? As a mutant, right? Think what happens when they finally became who they are, right? That was Sunspot's whole journey, right? That his mom completely rejected him, because she knew he was a mutant and even called the mutant authority on him, right? To get him collared and things like that. And so like these traumas that we're not dealing with, right? Got replicated even in Jubilee and Sunspot, even when Jubilee was like, come on, we're just going to be X Men. You'll be all right. We don't have to worry about it there. That's how Jubilee recruited him, right, into the group. So it's kind of perpetuating, like you said, that idea that if you just become an X Men or if you just learn how to use your powers, all will be fine. And they really don't pay attention to the fact that a lot of these mutants, by the time they get to Xavier's school, have had so much trauma that just learning how to use their powers isn't going to be enough, right?
And equally, whatever so-called psychological care that Xavier did for them isn't, I mean, because it's one of those questions, like, it's always been, why didn't Xavier just wipe Storm's claustrophobia? Because I guess because the reality is her claustrophobia is tied to too many things.
Yeah.
None of these things sit in isolation.
None of them. And they compound on each other, which is why they make the decisions. And I love that you said that, because in that moment when the adversary was using all of that against her, that's what she was using. She was using all of that stuff that we don't often talk about, your fear, your insecurity, right? Your deepest, darkest stuff. That's what the adversary was doing.
Her concern, and her concern for connection, for taking care of Forge.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the biggest strengths. She was willing to go and do those things because she wanted to see somebody. She wanted the opposite. She wanted somebody to survive.
Yeah.
Now, that can also come back to bite you if you go do that for the wrong people. And, well, let's be frank, Mr. Sinner's a perfect example of that. But it's that standpoint of, these are some of the nuances that are going on in these aspects. And I think sometimes we have to be very conscious about that message, not just for the kids that are looking at these, but even for the adults who are coming back for this nostalgia.
I agree.
And are we appropriately moving it forward for them?
100% agree. And I think that's something that hopefully, if it continues, we're able to see that in seasons 2 or 3.
Mm-hmm. Well, they said some doozies there, with at least the 3 different time zones. Which again,
I'll say this.
Yeah.
I know that, we're both kind of coming to the end here, but one thing I would love to explore just in general is Morph and how they used their character throughout, even making use of they, them, and making sure that everyone used their pronouns. I just really wanted to share that was one thing that, despite the other issues that were going on, they really used Morph and allowed Morph to show up in a way that I think was really organic and authentic.
Oh, well, let's spend a few more moments there. Even with Morph and, let's be frank, their unrequited feelings for Wolverine. And even if we go back to the original series, Wolverine was having certain concerns and feelings about Morph as well.
Yes.
But just but just as equally, we really didn't see much beyond what was in the original series of dealing with Morph's trauma of his death, or should I say their death under Mr. Sinister as well.
Yeah. And I think they really kind of glazed over being brainwashed and tortured and treated that way by Mr. Sinister too, because that is part of their trauma as well, that on top of everything else, Mr. Sinister had them completely under their control and could not think for themselves and could not make their own decisions. And so I think they needed to go back and talk about that trauma too, because it was kind of just like, they're cool now. They just can be part of the X Men now, which I think you said this. That's the cycle of X Men. Once you become an X Men, you're good. It's like, no, I'm not.
Yeah. And even what we get into with Madeline and the Goblin Queen and Jean, it's like, that's another story all its own and self. We're not going. We don't have the time for that. I mean, we could go through each of the X Men, have a very deep dive into all of them, but that's
and then randomly Phoenix just showed up. Where I'm like, I know Phoenix is part of Jean, but for her to come out as like a Deus Ex Machina kind of thing, that kind of felt a little overwhelming too.
Which again becomes that standpoint of, because there's always the classic jokes about Jean fainting. And that standpoint is like, oh, she didn't faint now. But this is, again, where our problem, the aspect of, and the thing that is reality of comics, is whoever's writing changes the power sets to fit whatever story they need.
You're correct. They do. You're not the one who says that. My husband actually says the same thing.
Yeah. It's been said about even Superman a number of times. Superman suddenly gets a new power. I mean, I'll be frank. And even though I was not particularly not the characters, but just some of the stories that they did in the last 3 of the Star Wars movies is like, okay, you're now telling me we've got force healing, force teleportation,
and force Bluetooth. Don't forget force Bluetooth.
Yeah, the force Bluetooth. It's like, excuse me. Yeah, you've just you've invented some new powers about the force that so far would have been made a lot more sense through the rest of this series, but now are only coming back here. Yeah. Come on here.
Exactly.
And so there's that critical aspect of when does a character's powers get rewritten and overset because it's necessary for the story. And again, we're struggling with that standpoint of, yes, we know they're trying to create a story and create a drama, but some of these things are not necessary. And in some ways, you're actually doing more harm by not moving into these other areas that are also very great and fundamental stories too.
Yes, exactly.
So, yeah, it's like the classic saying, Hollywood has only got like 13 or 17 different storylines they just keep repeating.
You're not wrong.
And I'll be frank, the redemption arc is one that they do a lot, and I think it's highly overused.
Yeah. I think it's the one that people relate to the most. The underdog story is why I think it gets used so much.
Yeah, but again, because we got to be wrapping up, there's the standpoint of they're missing some very critical steps in telling those stories, because there's a standpoint of, you want to take the path of redemption and healing, guess what? You're going to have to work. You're going to have to go through an entirely different set of experiences, and some of which will be painful to overcome that. Just saying that I want redemption and, for lack of a better word, not showing the effort, not bleeding for it, sets the wrong message.
Yeah.
Redemption is actually something that is the exception, not the rule. Because there's a lot of people who don't want to actually give up that identity of who they were to create a new identity.
You're not wrong at all.
And that also comes with healing. Is accepting help means stepping away from where you have been, stepping away from that nostalgia, which is both good as well as painful, to move yourself forward.
You preaching now. We at the Church of Perry now.
Well, I think it's the church of all of us as therapists trying to help our clients move forward and understand, especially those who have been caretaking and wanting to rescue, why somebody isn't being caretaken and rescued. I come back to the song by Abeji called Lavender and Roses, and which you're just going to have to go listen to that song, and I think you'll understand what I'm saying.
I love it.
But until next time, folks, I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist. This is Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered, and here with
Dr. Mercedes Samudio.
So
thanks for having me.
We'll be back again for another blurt out in the coming time as well, because we're definitely doing more of these. Yeah. All right. Take care, folks.
Thank you for tuning in for Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. Be sure to join your host, Perry Clark, for another episode on the podcast coming soon on the Voice America Empowerment Channel.